Howdy, this is Mark L. Redmond, Western author, coming to you from Apache Junction, Arizona. And I'm here to announce a new book. I want to add this video to my first chapters video that you'll find on my YouTube channel. I've completed and published the second book in the Box M Gang series. It's a middle grade series set in post-Civil War Arizona. The tale of 5 siblings, the Martin kids, and they've lost both their parents. And their big challenge now is to make sure that nobody finds out that they're living alone on the ranch, because if anybody finds out that they're orphans, they'll be carted off to Tucson and put into an orphanage. And of course, they don't want to do that. But I want to share the first chapter with you. Let me put my glasses on so I can see what I'm reading. This is how the book begins. Chapter 1, The Box M Gang and the Army. When things go too smoothly for a spell, I tend to get a little edgy. I don't doubt that God watches over us and blesses us and guides us. I just reckon trouble has been a part of life ever since Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. It had been a part of our lives, and it would be again. When trouble came knocking on my door, I didn't want to be surprised. For that reason, especially since Pa had died, I'd been watching for trouble. When my brother Thad, a year younger than I, stayed alert too. Even 12-year-old Sarah kept an eye out for anything that wasn't as it should be. Well, most of the time she did. 10-year-old Bart and 8-year-old Billy watched for trouble too, but mostly so they could jump into it with both feet. The 5 of us Martins had captured the outlaws who killed and butchered one of our cows. We had also chased away the Wells family when they tried to take over our ranch. Both times we'd had help from our friend Jim, a good-hearted bounty hunter. But we Martins had done our part too. As serious as those situations had been, the greatest danger we faced was keeping the secret that we lived on the Box M Ranch without parents. Although I did the work of a grown woman, the law saw me as only a 15-year-old girl. Failing to keep our secret would land all of us in an orphanage. For that reason, when it came to guarding our secret, I was all business. Running a ranch in the Arizona territory, even a small one like our Box M, wasn't an easy task. Some city folks reckon a ranch is pretty much the same as a farm, but Ma used to say that those people had most likely never been within 100 miles of either one. When Thad and I were little, she told us about the 300-acre farm in Indiana where she'd grown up. That farm and the Box M had little in common. Our ranch covered 240 acres, but we had no cornfields, no wheat fields, no green pastures with creeks running through them. We didn't raise ducks, geese, pigs, or goats. We did have a garden with 2 rows of corn, 2 rows of beans, some lettuce, carrots, cucumbers, watermelons, and pumpkins. We didn't get a lot of produce from our garden, but I reckon something is better than nothing. For livestock, we had 1 longhorn bull, 20 cows, 1 stallion, 12 mares, 5 ewes, a ram, and a flock of 20-some chickens, including 4 roosters. My tally of our livestock changed when cougars, coyotes, bobcats, or badgers came to visit. Jackrabbits and other small critters tended to help themselves to our garden whenever we weren't watching. One of the best things about living on a ranch instead of a farm is not having to plant and harvest crops. I don't reckon the five of us Martins could have kept up with that much work. Keeping up with the ranch work was hard enough most days, and we stayed busy. We'd never written a list of who was responsible for doing which chores, but even before Pa died, we had talked about our need to work together and about the chores that needed to be done. Without being told, Thad, Sarah, and I knew what to do. Billy and Bart usually needed a little guidance. Some days, they needed a lot. More than a month had passed since our friend Jim had ridden away from the Box M. As usual, spring brought hot days to the Arizona Territory. I stood on our porch, looking toward the stable and corral. I was thankful for the lack of company at the ranch since Jim had left. Sheriff Packard had stopped at our house once on his way to Tucson, but he had only stayed long enough to drink 2 cups of coffee and eat a biscuit. While he ate, I had talked enough that he didn't get a chance to ask about Pa. As always, I was happy to see him right away. Because the days get hotter during the spring season, we changed our work schedule. Some work had to be done in the afternoon, but we started earlier and worked harder to get as many of our chores as possible done before we ate our noon meal. I had washed the breakfast dishes and cut up the venison and vegetables for a stew that would be our supper. Once the stew was cooking on the stove, I had added wood to the stove's firebox and turned my attention to preparing lunch. Since the stove was hot, I set our big cast iron frying pan on top of it and added some lard. Thad had snared, skinned, and cleaned 2 large jackrabbits. I cut them into pieces, rolled the meat in flour, and laid it in the frying pan. By that time, the kitchen was warm enough to make me step outside while the rabbit cooked. From the porch, I watched Sarah as she took the clothes she had washed and hung them on the line to dry. The breeze coming from that direction carried the scent of lye soap. When I looked toward the stable, I saw Thad sitting on a stool in the stable doorway, mending a piece of leather from either a halter or a bridle. He paused long enough to slap a horsefly out of the air and step on it. I couldn't see either Bart or Billy, but they had brought a bucket of milk and a basket of eggs to the house an hour earlier. I reckoned they had gone fishing at our swimming hole. Although fishing seemed like playing to them, the fish they caught had provided our dinner many times. When I smelled the rabbit cooking, I walked into the kitchen, took the large iron fork from a hook on the wall, and turned over each piece of sizzling meat. By the time I had finished, I was sweating. I stepped onto the porch again to let the breeze cool me. Sarah had finished hanging the wet clothes and was taking down the last of the dry ones. She put them into a basket and brought them onto the porch. After putting the basket beside one of the chairs, she sat down. "Something smells good," she said. She pulled a shirt from the basket and began to fold it. "What's cooking?" "Rabbit for dinner and venison stew for supper," I said. "I'll help you fold as soon as I take the rabbit off the stove." Back in the kitchen, I wrapped a thick cloth around the handle of the frying pan and set the pan on an iron plate that Pa had built into the top of the sideboard next to the stove. Sarah had been right. The food smelled delicious. I returned to the porch and sat in the chair beside Sarah. Pulling a pair of Billy's breeches from the basket, I began to fold them. Thank you for taking care of the laundry, I said. I'm proud of you, and Ma would be proud of you too. When Sarah didn't reply, I looked at her. She finished rolling a pair of socks together, dropped them into her lap, and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. I miss her so much. She put a hand to her mouth, but she couldn't stop the sob that choked her. So do I said. I wiped my eyes. We all miss her. She was... Bart and Billy, both yelling, rode their pretend horses into the yard at full gallop. When they spotted Thad coming out of the stable, Bart motioned for him to follow them. Stopping at the foot of the steps in front of the porch, both riders dismounted and saluted Sarah and me. Sergeant and Lieutenant Martin wish to report, ma'am, Billy said. Sarah and I returned their salute and tried not to laugh. Go ahead, Lieutenant Martin, I said. Begging your pardon, ma'am, Billy said. He pointed at Bart. He's Lieutenant Martin. He tapped his chest. I'm Sergeant Martin. Sarah rolled her eyes. I was thankful to see her smiling. Well, Sergeant Martin, she said, give us your report. Permission to wait for Private Martin, ma'am, Bart said. He looked over his shoulder and saw Thad walking toward the house, shaking his head and grinning. Turning back to Sarah and me, he said, Private Martin fell off his mount and had to continue on foot. He'll be here soon. He needs to hear this report. Before he sat on the steps, facing his brothers, Thad saluted both them and us. We returned his salute. Well, Lieutenant Martin and I were on fish collection duty, Billy said. We observed a herd of escaped cattle. When Thad turned to look at me, neither of us was grinning. Thad looked at his brothers. You saw a herd of escaped cattle? He asked. Yes, sir, Billy said. Where? Thad asked. By the fishing depot, sir, Billy said. They were drinking the water. Did you get a tally? Thad asked. Billy looked at Bart. Lieutenant, he asked. Bart pulled a pretend notebook from his pretend uniform pocket and flipped through it. After clearing his throat, he read, Cows, 23, bulls, 2. All right, that's enough soldier play for now, Thad said. He stood, his hands on his hips, facing the boys. Wait, Bart said. He put his arm around Billy's shoulders. Billy removed his hat and bowed his head. Bart stepped away from his brother, drew his pretend revolver, and pointed it at a spot near Billy's feet. Bang! He said. He returned his revolver to its holster and nodded at Thad. What was that about? Thad asked. We had to ride hard to get here, sir, Bart said. Sergeant Martin ran his horse too hard. It was his favorite horse, a fine animal, but I had to put it down. I'm afraid Sergeant Martin is taking it rather hard. Sarah and I had done well to that point. When Thad turned to look at us, all three of us started laughing. Bart and Billy stood at attention until we had stopped. Thad looked at Sarah and me. Do you reckon there's anything like the truth mixed into their story? He asked. How could our whole herd have broken out of the pasture? We've never had a single cow escape from there since Pa and I built it 6 years ago. Permission to speak, ma'am, Billy said. Thad rolled his eyes when I replied, Permission granted, Sergeant Martin. I reckon when Private Martin fell off his mount, Billy said, his ears got filled with dirt. Lieutenant Martin never said the herd of cattle belonged to the Box M. Thad grinned and shook his finger at Sarah and me when he saw us put our hands over our mouths. Don't you two start that again. he said. I'll go down to the swimming hole with these two and clear things up. Thad turned and walked toward the corral. Bart stepped forward and saluted. If you don't mind, ma'am, he said, we'll need to borrow 2 horses. We'll return them and bury the sergeant's horse after we've completed our mission. Of course, I said. Your horse must be exhausted. Bart looked confused. Patting his pretend horse, he said, my mount has caught his wind while we were talking. The second horse is for Private Martin. I'd recommend the gentlest mount you have, ma'am. The private is a brave man in battle, but I'm afraid he's not much of a rider. Bart mounted his pretend horse, and Billy ran to catch up with Thad. They had reached the corral before I was able to speak. Help yourselves, soldiers, I called after them. That was all I was able to say before Sarah and I burst out laughing. So that's chapter 1, how the story starts off, and these 5 siblings have a lot of adventure lined up for them in this second book. I'm happy to present it to you, and I hope a number of you will read it and give me some feedback on it and let me know what you think. Right now, I'm busy working on the 4th Nate Landry novel. When I get done with that, I'll let you know, and I'll be back. Until then, thank you for reading my books, for following my blog, for being my friends. Happy trails.